The Sine Institute of Policy and Politics is American University's incubator for policy innovation. We convene leaders in the academic, public, private, nonprofit, and journalism sectors to engage and promote common ground and nonpartisan solutions. In an evolving world, we seize the opportunity to work on the nation's most pressing challenges through collaboration by experts and top scholars in their field with students in research and scholarship. As part of that goal, the Sine Institute leverages American University's location in our nation's capital, the nexus of government and a growing international business center. We connect diverse perspectives from around the country and around the world with our world-class academics and research, experienced practitioners, and the most politically active student body in the U.S. We stand apart through our focus on the role of business and the nonprofit community in public policy, the rise of the importance of economic regions in the United States, and international policy issues. Our focus is to make an immediate impact at the intersection of policy and politics that leads to real and lasting change. Thank you for joining us as we convene, communicate, and collaborate.
Good evening. Thank you for joining us today for distinguished lecturer, CNN anchor, and Chief National Security Analyst, Jim Sciutto, who is here to discuss and highlight his new book, The Return of Great Powers, Russia, China, and the Next World War. My name is Sarah Carney, and I am a second-year student studying public relations and strategic communications with a minor in political science here at American University. On behalf of the Sine Institute and myself, we are so pleased you have joined us for this event. The Sine Institute is a laboratory for university-wide collaboration and an incubator for policy innovation, convening the best and brightest in the public, private, academic, and nonprofit sectors, as well as journalism. The Institute is where the brightest minds engage to promote common ground and nonpartisan solutions. It is where American University comes to convene, communicate, and collaborate. Today, we are thrilled to welcome Jim Sciutto to campus. Jim is CNN's Chief National Security Analyst and anchor of CNN Newsroom with Jim Sciutto. Sciutto reports and provides analysis on all aspects of U.S. national security, including foreign policy, the military, intelligence community, and the State Department. Throughout his career, he has reported from more than 50 countries across the globe, including dozens of assignments from inside Iraq, Afghanistan, and Iran. Among the honors Sciutto's work has earned are Emmy Awards, the Edward R. Murrow Award, the George Polk Award, and the White House Correspondents Association's Merriman Smith Award for excellence in presidential coverage. Prior to joining CNN, Sciutto served as ABC News' senior foreign correspondent based in London and the Hong Kong-based correspondent for Asia Business News. Sciutto began his career as the moderator and producer of a weekly public affairs talk show on PBS. Sciutto has also served as chief of staff and senior advisor to the U.S. ambassador to China, Gary Locke. He is a graduate of Yale University, where he studied Chinese history and was a Fulbright Fellow in Hong Kong. He is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and an associate fellow at Pearson College at Yale. In conversation today with Jim is our very own Amy Dacey, Executive Director of the Sine Institute of Policy and Politics at American University. Please welcome Jim and Amy.
Thank you. So, can everybody hear me? I feel very, it's intimidating sitting across from a journalist who usually gets to ask the question. So thank you so much. Thank you so much, Sarah, and then Sydney and Matthew. These are we call them the generals. They're our general student associates who have been working on this event for you, Jim, and getting the word out, and they've done a great job. So we appreciate you all. And I also want to thank our School of Communications and our School of International Service, who are co-sponsoring this event with us tonight, and appreciate their support. Jim, it is an honor to have you on campus with us and talking about, I was so excited when I knew your book was coming out in March and the timing of this and how we would get to talk to you when it first came out. In an interesting way, we've got a couple connections with Jim. First of all, the Honorable Gary Locke was one of our fellows here at the Sine Institute, so we're very proud of that. And the best thing about the Sine Institute, I was having coffee with one of our other former fellows, Bill Crystal, who, if you know my background, you're like, Amy's having coffee with Bill Crystal, it's pretty interesting. But as we were having coffee, he introduced me to Jim, and you were working on the book at that time, and then here we are to fast forward to today. So welcome to American University.
Thanks for having me. And so that was at Bluestone, just around the corner here. And I have a habit of writing in coffee shops. I can't write with too much noise or too little, right? Like I can't sit I can't sit in the basement of my house. I need to have a little activity, and I need to have access to coffee. So I did so many writing sessions there, and it was natural that I would run into
Yes,
you.
and timing is everything. So we're so appreciative. Maybe, Jim, the best place to start really is to just have you share your original thoughts and why, this work was so important to you. I think that would be helpful.
For sure. I'm going to dial it back just a few more years to start, just because I was doing a little math earlier today on when I was a student, when I was a freshman in college, which sadly was 35 years ago, and I can't believe that's a figure. But the reason I bring that up is because I was there at the end of my freshman year around this time trying to figure out what I was going to major in. And I knew I wanted to be a history major, but I didn't know what I was going to focus on in history. And I was considering Middle European history, American political history. There were a lot of those folks at Yale, a whole host of things. And then what happened actually was history happened right around me. And that's what led me down the path to study China and so on, because it was May 1989, long before many of you were born, but you'll remember in May 1989, in China, events were happening, consequential events. And as it happened, one of my sisters was studying in China at the time, and my parents and another sister were visiting her there. So they found themselves in late May 1989 in Beijing in the midst of popular demonstrations, pro-democracy demonstrations led by university students, consequentially crowding in Tiananmen Square. And we have these family photos of my family in the midst of this, which was before the events of the night of June 4th, the sad events, was this exciting, euphoric time there. There was dancing, there were banners, they made this Statue of Liberty kind of evocative statue. There's a replica of it actually down close to the Capitol building. You could drive by it there. And it was a moment where people thought China was going to change for the better. My parents left the day, and sisters left the day that martial law was declared in late May, and then over the succeeding days, as they kept traveling around Asia, of course, they read in the newspapers the sad events in the early morning hours when the tanks rolled in, and so many of those students they knew that they had seen in that moment had lost their lives in the midst of it, or sent off to prison to never be heard from again. I still have in my house actually the newspapers that my mom collected as they were traveling around from Japan and Hong Kong and elsewhere with those front page pictures. The reason I bring that up is here I wanted to study history and thinking back to these distant times and eras, but there was history happening right before me. And that's what led me to say, I got to study what the heck is happening in China. I really got to figure out what's going on with this place and what led to it. As it happened, 1989 was a consequential year for other reasons, because later that year, the Berlin Wall came down in November 1989. And then just a couple of years after that, we had the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991. And at that point, those of us here old enough will will say, well, there was this brief period where we thought the world had changed for the better forever, really. It was the end of the Cold War. Peace would be upon us. Old enemies would be our friends. And we wouldn't have to worry about things like we had worried about for decades, the onset of nuclear war, great power conflict, proxy wars between the superpowers, that was a thing of the past. And the truth is there was a lot of hope at that time. And there was a time in the 90s when the US and Russia did a lot of things together, not just business, but in diplomacy and so on. We signed new nuclear agreements. We took the nuclear weapons out of Ukraine. Hold that thought, because consequential in the years to come. But we did all these things that we thought had put that era behind us. So turn the clock ahead to February of 2022. I find myself in Ukraine covering the start of Russia's invasion. I'm there as the tanks are coming across the border, and the first cruise missiles are falling on Ukrainian cities, and I could see the thing about a cruise missile is you could see it flying, right? It flies kind of like a Cessna, right? You could see it kind of flying across the horizon. You're like, I wonder where that cruise missile is going, and I hope it's not coming to me. But I witnessed this happening, and though in the years prior to that, I had reported on and written on the deterioration of the relationship between the US and Russia, and Russia's increasing aggression and China's increasing aggression. That was the subject of my book, the Shadow War in 2019, which was about how Russia and China were already fighting a war in effect against the US, but in the shadows below the threshold of open conflict. While I'd done a lot of reporting on that prior, the advent of the largest invasion the world had seen since World War II, literally tanks rolling across the border in Europe, an attempt to absorb the largest country in Europe, struck me as a clean break between that moment and the 30 years prior of the post-Cold War era, when we thought that we could find a way to make peace with each other and deal with each other in a peaceful way. And that was really the inspiration for the book. As I was there in Ukraine, I said, I've got to talk to people about what has changed and what this new era will look like, what the dangers are, and hopefully what are the pathways to allow us to avoid an open conflict. So those two moments, more than 30 years apart, hope and then hope dashed, and now genuine worry today. I mean, the book is a warning. It's not meant to frighten anybody, but it is meant to warn, and it is also meant, hopefully, to find paths to, I mean, one of the chapters, the final chapter is called Paths to Peace so that we could avoid open conflict.
Well, I have to say, reading the book prior to us getting together, and I do have proof. I mean, if anybody knows I've done these events before, this is how I process. But
that's the best compliment you can give an author. Is to have
oh my gosh,
notes.
I went through an entire post-it note for you, Jim. But it was compelling and it was interesting, but it was also, as you mentioned, for some of us, we might have gone through an era where Russia had a different, meaning to us. But for those not in the room too, when the Ukraine war began, you said on air, we are in a 1939 moment. Can you help explain and help us understand what do you mean by a 1939?
I do truly believe it. And that year and the characters from that time, Hitler and others, their ghosts have been raised many times. People have used, they called Saddam Hussein a Hitler, right? This has been evoked before, but I believe this one is real for a number of reasons, because Putin does know he has not carried out the Holocaust, so I don't want to say that there's a complete equivalency there. But in terms of his willingness to use force to redraw the borders of Europe on a grand scale, right? Not a tiny little piece here. I mean, he started that way, a piece of Georgia in 2008, two pieces of Ukraine in 2014. But in 2022, he believed he could absorb a country of 40 million people, the largest country by landmass too in Europe, because he just wants it, right? He wants to resurrect his vision of the Soviet, of the old Soviet, the Russian Empire. And so one, you have that character, right? You have that leader willing, who is hungry for land and hungry for power and willing to, as the CIA director, Bill Burns, described it to me in the book, to take the temple down, right? He wants to take the temple down and the international order down. That does have very genuine parallels to 1939. And then the other piece of that is that 1939 was a test, right? It was a test for the world, as I believe this is a test for us, because we can imagine, as many people do in this country, that that's their problem over there, and it's not going to bother me. Just like Taiwan is their problem, just like many Americans said in 1939 that Poland was their problem. We can imagine that, but I genuinely believe that's not true, because one, we depend on a peaceful Europe. We benefit from a peaceful Europe. These are our allies. And the thing about Hitler's and Putin's is that they are not easily satisfied. The Estonian prime minister, who I profile in great detail in the book, because Estonia is right on Russia's border, and they fear that they're the next target for Putin. And by the way, they're not making this stuff up, right? They lived under Soviet oppression until 1991. That's like a minute ago, So they're not basing this off fantasy. They're basing it off genuine experience. She quotes Churchill about Hitler with regards to Putin and says, and I'm paraphrasing a bit here, that an appeaser is someone who feeds the crocodile and expects he will be its last meal. Yeah. And Hitler had that quality. Just give him Sudetenland, everything will be fine. Poland, not really our problem. And then there's France, and then there was almost the UK and more. And Putin is similar. little bit of Georgia, a little bit of Ukraine, all of Ukraine. And by the way, I don't believe the Baltic states exist either. They're part of the Soviet Union. So you have to listen to what these guys say and watch what they do, and be on warning, in effect.
Well, it's interesting because you mentioned the word power, and you help define this shift in the world order as a struggle for power. How do you define power?
Well, you mean define a power or like the use of power?
The use of power.
So in this conflict, I believe it's multi-front. I mean, the Russians have an expression for it. It's total war, in part because that's their theory of warfare, fight on multiple fronts at once. But two, because we have so many technologies and fields of play that we didn't have before. So nuclear weapons only existed in the very final days, really weeks of World War II. So we didn't really have that in the conflict then. Now we have the US and Russia, the two largest nuclear powers in the world, and China, the fastest growing nuclear power. Plus you have a North Korea nuclear power. You have an Iran that is this far away from being a nuclear power. So you have weapons capable of devastating the world. That's a pretty alarming and colossal risk that we face. And I tell the story in the book about just how close we came to a Russian nuclear strike in Ukraine in late 2022, which we can get into more detail later. The unthinkable has become thinkable again. Then you have other fronts. Cyber warfare is alive and well. It's happening right now before our eyes. Russia and China, there are cyber attacks every day, big and small, and there are cyber weapons planted in critical systems here, critical infrastructure systems, and by the way, that we've planted in their systems. So the age of cyber warfare is already present. We're certainly seeing it play out in the Ukraine war. Add to that another layer, which is space weapons. We've entered the dawn of the weaponization of space, to the point where just a few weeks ago, I'm sure you read in the papers, there was a US warning about Russia deploying a nuke in space as sort of a ultimate space weapon, and that it would zap, dozens of satellites at once. And then you have another front of information warfare, which is very active in our elections and our social media every day. Disinformation, attempts to further divide us internally. So power has many fronts and many definitions, which make this great power conflict all the more complicated and dangerous, because it gives you more places where you can shoot at each other, so to speak.
And do you think that Putin has that definition of power, the same one, or what?
I believe so, because his strategy, we've called it the Gerasimov doctrine, because a number of years ago, his equivalent to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs wrote about this very publicly, but it's total war. It's about attempting to weaken your enemy on many fronts at once and constantly. And even before you're formally at war, just in the kind of state of competition, cyber attacks, stealing some territory when you can do it, interfering in elections to effect, this kind of thing. So he certainly does. And China has a similar tool book. They deploy it a bit differently, but they have a similar toolbox, rather, I should say.
And that's military power. Is economic power also in this conversation?
100%,
well?
yes.
So,
I mean, from China's perspective, you see China has deployed it. They've deployed it against us in ways. They've deployed it against others who get on their bad side. I tell the story in the book about how China and Australia, which had a very, a pretty integrated economic relationship, to some degree, diplomatic relationship. But when Australia did things that ticked China off, which were not, Australia did things like question China's treatment of, dissidents, right?
Yeah.
China didn't like that. And as part of the punishment, they said, we're not going to buy any more Australian beef, right? And a whole host of things. So China deploys economic coercion against Australia. They certainly do it against Taiwan. They've done it against the Philippines when they were on different sides of land battles in the South and East China Sea. They're like, we're not going to buy your bananas. I mean, literally. So, and these are things that have economic consequences, which, by the way, the U.S. deploys as well, right? I mean, economic sanctions have become a favorite tool, national security tool for the U.S. in response to the Ukraine invasion. I mean, Europe imposed probably the biggest economic sanction on Russia post-invasion by just saying, we're not buying any more of your oil or natural gas, which is amazing. I mean, we like Americans are like, oh, we suffered from the Ukrainian war because gas was 75 cents more expensive for like 6 months. Germany stopped buying from its number one energy supplier in the span of months. It's pretty remarkable with enormous economic costs. And they've switched, they've adjusted. Russia found other buyers. China and India are willing to buy it on the cheap. But so economic warfare is too strong a word, but economic power is definitely part of the field of play.
So history tells us what the US's role was in this 1939 moment. What is the US's role in this modern 1939 moment? And are we prepared to be on a multi-front?
Well, let's see. First on what we have, this country has a major choice in November about what the US role will be in this, right? Because you have two candidates who have diametrically opposed visions of the US role in the world. You have Biden, which is a largely status quo, and by the way, bipartisan picture of the US, alliances at the central of our national security policy, NATO, alliance with South Korea, with Japan and others, new alliances with Australia, for instance, and the UK. And the US, I mean, people will use the term global policeman. I mean, the theory is that there's a rules-based international order that benefits us, benefits our allies, and by the way, benefits even our adversaries. And I think that's not a BS point, right? I mean, China's economy has grown in part from peace for decades in Asia, open sea lanes, trading lanes, and massive trading partner in the US. That if you didn't have peace in Asia or those sea lanes weren't open and generally policed and a general confidence in the rule of law, you wouldn't have those things. So, I mean, that's the argument that presidents of both parties in this country have made for decades. So that's the Biden status quo going forward. Trump wants to retreat from it. This is the theory of America First, which, by the way, has a near mirror parallel to the America First movement of 1939, 1940 that was propagated by the Charles Lindberghs of the world and so on. I mean, you could lift their sound bites from 1940 and it's exactly what you're hearing from Trump and others today. So in November, you have a choice. It's not just sort of a nuance, marginal tax rates, or are we going to have this many troops here or there? It is is the US going to continue that path, or is the US going to really do a 180 and say, we don't need those alliances anymore, they're too costly? Do we really have to defend Europe? I mean, and I'm not making it up. First of all, in the book, I've interviewed several of Trump's former senior advisors, John Kelly, John Bolton, and others who say, in a second Trump term, no more aid for Ukraine. NATO, if the US isn't out of NATO, it is neutered because the commander-in-chief will make clear he's not going to enforce Article 5 mutual defense commitments. Similar concerns for South Korea and Japan, and no chance for Taiwan to be defended. So that's a choice. Some Americans may be more comfortable with that choice than America's current role, but it will have enormous effect for our security and for the security of our allies going forward.
It's always humbling to me when I travel abroad and you bring up, especially if you say you're from Washington, D.C., immediately the conversation goes to, the amount that individuals often know about our elections, about what's happening in our country, and being naive in their own and not knowing what the world is watching, right? We can't not, you mentioned this national election that's looming, around us. Some of us have been eating and sleeping and breathing it every day because that's what we do. But voters in America will wake up, and closer to the election and, get engaged in a lot more ways. What is the world seeing when they see this country with a January 6th?
Yeah.
What do they see when, there's an election that's contested in a way? Like, how are they viewing us in this time?
The loss of US soft power over years, but even decades, it didn't just start in the last couple of years. Fiona Hill talks about this a lot, and I've interviewed her in the past. I mean, connecting the dots on January 6th, and the weeks-long effort to overturn a U.S. election, going back to the financial crisis of 2008, did not make U.S. corporate governance look particularly good. Going back to the Iraq invasion in 2003 did not make the U.S. intelligence community look very good, right? Or, I mean, and then just the cost of that war going forward. That you can connect your dots through, and I'm not bemoaning the collapse of my country. I'm an American. I love my country. I defend my country in 1,000 dinner party conversations wherever I've lived. But America lives or dies by also acknowledging its mistakes and trying to correct those mistakes. And there have been events in recent years that have stolen some of that soft power and credibility. There have been other events that have revamped it, or at least added to it. I think that if you looked at the expectation of how the U.S. and NATO would respond to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, there were a lot of folks, Putin included, who were like, you guys are going to fold on day one. And lo and behold, no. I mean, there's still a debate in this country as to whether they will send aid to Ukraine, even though large majorities support it. But NATO got bigger, not smaller. It added two major allies in Finland and Sweden. NATO has largely stayed together. Viktor Orban has been an outlier, and NATO just crushed it, right? I mean, they just crushed him and got him on board with additional aid to Ukraine. So and the U.S. economy is growing strongly, and despite the efforts to overturn the election, it didn't happen, right? So there are reasons for hope, but we have to acknowledge that there are things that have sapped American credibility. And setting that aside for a moment, regardless of what they think of the system or how it's standing up, the choice that voters will make this fall will have enormous consequences for them, right? I speak to European national security officials, and I've been asking them for months. I was like, that you have two different presidential candidates here, and your national security is built on NATO existing. And it may not exist in the same way on November 6th, 2024. What's your plan? Do you have a plan? Can you show me the plan? And for a long time, the answer was, the public answer would be, we have confidence in America as our NATO ally. We believe they will come through. The private answer would be, but yes, we're watching really closely, and God forbid that would happen. Now you're hearing more public commentary on this. Emmanuel Macron speaking openly, we can't rely on the U.S. anymore. And the truth is, they can't. Right? Because if you have an election where, American international policy will change like this, then it's irresponsible as a European leader or a South Korean leader or a Japanese leader to not have a plan, because you may have a very different reality in a few months' time.
So because we're in a democracy, because people will be making decisions in November, sometimes we're so, consumed with the things right in front of us. There's a lot of Americans who are worried about how are they going to afford, to get food on the table, get their kids to school, take care of, family members. But yet it's really important to understand this interconnectivity and how foreign policy does affect our everyday lives. So what would you say to somebody who's trying to navigate their day to day, but they have to be engaged and know this?
I've been trying to do this as I've been doing interviews for the book, right? Because you have different audiences. And here's the thing, beyond the threats, right? Beyond the fact that in a conflict like this, even if it's not a full-on declared shooting war, Russia and China already have capabilities to affect our lives here, where we're sitting, right? With cyber attacks and whether those are attacks that turn the lights off in Washington or just steal your personal data, right? That's already happening right now. So you can't imagine that you could retreat behind the ramparts and not be touched by it. I'm sure everybody in this room has been hacked. I'm 100% sure of it. I know I've been hacked at least 4 times. And all of those biggest hacks, and I'm not just talking about personal attempts, which has happened too, like phishing, et cetera, but like big cyber attacks by nation states with the aim of gathering information to target and weaken the U.S. Just from my perspective, and I bet you Glenn Gerstel, who's in the former Intel official, has had the same experience. But I'll give you the 4 hacks for me. One is Equifax. Does your credit score, mortgage, et cetera. So there's a nice little file with all of my financial information sitting on a server in China. Anthem Health Insurance. all the health insurance information, every test I've ever had, my wife has had, our 3 kids have had, sitting on that same server. OPM, the Office of Personnel Management, if you ever served in government. So every bit of data that you provide for that, which is Social Security numbers, again, health information, et cetera, on that file. The final one, which is kind of interesting, Marriott hotels. Now that seems kind of silly, but China uses that because it's one way that they can see where you travel. Marriott hotels are a favorite hotel of government workers because the price point tends to be within the okay price point for government travel. And by where you travel, they can put that into the matrix to figure out, are you, for instance, just one question, are you an Intel guy as opposed to, say, just a regular old diplomat? He's spending a lot of time in Azerbaijan. That's sort of weird, you know, for a cultural attaché, whatever, you know, you put that into the big picture. So already, you know, the information is targeted. That's why people worry about TikTok, by the way. So that gives them a whole host of other information, where you are physically and all that kind of stuff. So information, critical infrastructure that we rely on, that stuff is already vulnerable. So that's like that's the negative stuff, like the stuff that can come to hurt you. But the rules-based international order, as wonky as that term is and as dusty as that idea sounds, gives us a lot of stuff that makes our lives better. For one, a peaceful Europe, a peaceful Asia is a more economically prosperous Asia, so that our economy is stronger, and that helps us, means you guys are more likely to get jobs. And by the way, when you're looking for jobs, you might be able to get a job posted in Seoul or Prague, or, you know, or work for a company that has jobs there because they're expanding their business around the world to places that when we were coming out of school wouldn't have been opportunities, you know. So general prosperity, you know, your chances of doing a summer abroad in Eastern Europe, that was not a possibility for me when I was a kid. It is for you. That, you know, put that into the pot of things, the benefit that you get. But also living in a world where when folks are generally living by those rules and not trying to absorb entire countries in Europe by a bloody years-long invasion that's killed tens of thousands of people, right? That is generally good for peace in the world too, and our travel and you know, our safety. So though those are things we benefit from and might take for granted. And in a world where you allow 1939 rules to prevail, that stuff all becomes vulnerable, and we're likely to lose it. And it'd be nice to think we could just live our lives here on our little floating continent and not have to worry about it. But the truth is, we'll pay a price for that.
Well, I think one of the big differences from 1939 too is so much about physical borders. But to your point, especially with data and cyber, like wars are fought on different fronts, and it's not over there, to your point. So when the conflict started in Ukraine and you're there and it's happening real time, when you are talking about it, do you take that history background that you have and apply it to it, or are you looking at it through a brand new lens?
No, I try to do both, right? Because I'm trying to connect the dots, right, through time. And these trend lines, these events didn't come out of nowhere, right? There were events and warning signs. I mean, I mentioned June 1989. That was a choice. We talk about choices today, right? You know, do we want 1939 rules to prevail, or do we want to stand up to them? That's a choice for us. And there are costs associated with a yes answer to that question. That, you know, I will not allow this to stand. There are definitely costs, but there's certainly costs to just, forget about it. You know, screw those guys, you know, the Ukrainians and the Taiwanese and the Baltics and so on. So we have a choice, but, you know, look back to China in 1989 had a choice, and it chose, it had people who loved their country, who wanted to change it for the better and allowing more choice and open society, and the government crushed them like a bug, right? That was a choice. And it was also a signal. And I think one lesson of those 30 years of relative peace is that there were many signals and warning signs through that time from both Russia and China that we should have seen and that folks ignored. And in my last book, a lot of the folks who were in charge in through those various administrations copped to it. I interviewed Ash Carter, who sadly passed away, but was defense secretary in a number of positions. And he said, we were guilty of mirroring, that through those years, we looked at Russia and China and believed they wanted what we wanted. when in reality they didn't. And look at Russia too. I mean, the signals prior to February 2022 were pretty clear. Tanks roll into Georgia in 2008. Little green men pop up in Crimea in 2014. The largest cyber attack nation on nation was Russia on Estonia in 2007. After Estonia was already in 2007. After Estonia was already in NATO. So this idea that NATO is impregnable or untouchable or Russia would never go there, they've already gone there. Russia is killing dissidents not just in its country but out of its country. In London and cities. So we've had a lot of warning signs through those time, and there's that recent history about the Putins and the Xis of the world that give you an indication of what they're willing to do. With Xi, I think the example is that their land grab was without a shot, but it was still without firing a shot, but was still a land grab. They took over the entire South China Sea, built militarized islands there that are now unsinkable aircraft carriers. On territory rich in natural resources claimed by 6 countries. So they made their land grab in a very stealthy way. So again, there were signals throughout in recent history, and then I think you could then draw strands from those leaders to more distant history, in that they're following the playbook that we've seen before from the Hitlers of the world and others going back through time. As they say, like history may not repeat itself, but it rhymes, and I think a lot of this does rhyme.
Well, it's interesting because you've had that unique perspective of being on the front lines of conflict, of being, whether it was in Ukraine or the Middle East, and reporting. And you are able to put a face and a name, to these conflicts. So how do we separate leaders from the people of that country? And how do we, or should we, or, when we're talking about, are the Russian people to blame for if there's something going on? Or, should we be mad at the Chinese people for, how do we juggle that?
Well, I think in my own experience, I lived in China for 2 years, and I lived in Hong Kong in the 90s for 5 years. I have a lot of Chinese friends. I enjoyed traveling the country.
Your family was
there. My family was there.
Yeah.
I took my kids, put them in Chinese school, right? I mean, they speak Chinese better than me now, which I'm a little bit jealous of. But anyway, jealous and proud at the same time. In Russia, I've taken many trips to Russia. I've taken many trips to Iran and had the warmest reception. So I think it is extremely important for us to separate governments from people. And oftentimes in these places, people can't stand their governments, right?
Right.
And also in these places, a lot of people do love their government, but they're not necessarily bad people, right? And they may not have the fullest information. I mean, I genuinely believe Russians do not know the full scale of losses in Ukraine. I think that they've been fed years of disinformation, so tend to believe what Putin believes, which is that, well, Ukraine was a big NATO plot to take over Russia, that kind of stuff. Then you throw into the mix national pride, cultural history, a memory of their own history, which is, by the way, not entirely fair. I mean, China, Xi Jinping, both Putin and Xi are driven by history to some degree. Xi is trying to right the wrongs of the 19th century when and I'll say this openly, when the West, including the US, went there and behaved really damn badly, right? So
right.
You throw all that in the mix, and you can understand why human beings can come to support a government like that, although many do not. And I don't, listen, in our own country, we have people who believe a lot of dumb stuff, right? And doesn't make them horrible people. And we have to be able to make that separation as best we can. On the other hand, in democracies in particular, you have agency. So we all share a responsibility for the actions of our country abroad.
Let me ask you, because as you've mentioned, I try to avoid it, but you've mentioned that we grew up in the Cold War era, you and I.
Mm-hmm. But we were babies during that time, right? Yeah.
But I do remember growing up, and half of my mom's side of the family is Polish, and so also grew up in that movement during the Solidarity movement, the Cold War era, like all of this. It was, as a young person, having family, see what they're going through. Can you help some of, especially the younger people in the room, understand what defined the Cold War era and what's similar and what's so different now?
So the Cold War, I mean, we grew up in a time when the world had this one big dividing line, right? It was like the folks who were on America or the West side and folks on the Russian side. And almost every, I mean, there were 9 aligned powers, as we called them, but it just struck me that in every conflict or field of play, it was like their team and our team. And that was true in 1,000 different wars, right? In South America, Africa, and elsewhere. It was true at the Olympics, right? It was true at literally every American movie. The bad guys were the Russians, right? And then it's funny, it was in 1991, Hollywood was like, oh, who are the bad guys now? They were like, they tried drug dealers, they tried, they were like, we got to try something. But the world was aligned that way. And because that was the reality of that relationship. And that relationship had city-destroying nuclear missiles aimed at each other every waking moment, right? And when we look back in retrospect, there were more times that we came close to that kind of conflict than we realized. I mean, the declassification of records revealed a few different times when signals were misread and we almost got there. I mean, the most public example is the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, when it was quite public that we came close to nuclear war, right? I mean, and if you read the history of the conversations in the White House about it, I mean, JFK asked the Pentagon to estimate how many people would be killed in a nuclear exchange, and it was tens of millions of people, right? I mean, it's like just off the scale. And it's interesting talking about history, and I tell this story in the book too. So in 1962, he made sure every member of his cabinet read The Guns of August, which by happenstance, Guns of August was a story of the fall into World War I. And this kind of momentum of intertangling alliances a war happening that no one wanted. And he made sure every member of his cabinet read The Guns of August, which came out earlier in 1962, like a gift from God, so that he could avoid those same mistakes. In fact, he said to his brother, RFK, he said, I don't want anybody to be writing a book called The Missiles of 1962 about decisions that we're making today. And when you think about it, the thing about history is that the distance between those events seems long, but 1962 to 1914, it's like 40, 50 years. I mean, that's like one Mets World Championship ago. It's not that long ago. This is like Pretty in Pink times, mid-'80s. I don't know, movies. It doesn't seem that long ago to me.
Yeah.
And then, by the way, I mean, 1939 to 1962 was 20 years. It's nothing. It's a minute since 9/11. So he was thinking in those terms, and I think that we today, history can be our guide to some degree, not just in terms of, the crocodile, beware of trying to appease these guys who will make you their next meal, but also what did they learn from 1962? In the wake of that, they instituted a hotline, a red phone between Moscow and Washington, because both sides realized we got to be able to talk to each other so that we don't misunderstand each other and end up shooting at each other. It began a momentum towards nuclear talks to limit weapons and warheads, which we did in a series of things. So out of near conflict and out of situations like we have today, that urgency can create the path towards ways to avoid conflict. But it takes awareness of the dangers, and then it takes a willingness and leadership and risk, and also setting red lines and saying, we will not let Ukraine stand. And I want to be very clear about that. And China, don't think about Taiwan. These things, clear communication matters. So you could learn both negative and positive lessons from history.
I'm going to ask one final question. So I want our students to get some questions ready, but I think it's truly very reflective of you and people, the respect people have for you, because it was amazing. And when you all read the book and buy multiple copies, you will know as well that people that you had access to in this book. I mean, we're talking Secretary of State Alan Blinken, CIA Director Bill Burns, Joint Chiefs Chairman Mark Milley. They all talked to you about this. Was there something that stood out from your conversations with them that surprised you, as somebody who follows this every day?
So their genuine concern about the state of the world, that they were not blowing smoke about the danger points, the dangers and the combination of dangers today. Bill Burns talked about how, the worry is that a small incident escalating into something bigger, like one jet swing clips another jet's wing in one of these close confrontations that we see in so many places, and a pilot dies, and then you shoot back, and before you know it, he says you're off to the races. That, when they talk about it, and they talk about that on the record, they're not doing that just for fun, right? They're doing that because they are concerned. And I know that behind the scenes, they are fighting, right, to open lines of communication to avoid instances of escalation. And the story I tell in late 2022, when the U.S. was extremely concerned that Russia was going to use a tactical nuclear weapon in Ukraine, they marshaled the world to try to avoid this happening. Not just U.S. officials calling their Russian counterparts, or NATO and allied officials calling their counterparts, but they called up Beijing, they called up China and India, and said, we need your help. This is serious. And China and India showed up. They made public statements, they made private communications, communicating to the Kremlin, do not light off a nuke. No one wants this. So they take it very seriously. And that, I don't know if that surprised me, but it did. It certainly concerned me.
And
but I was
consistently, all of them
yes,
were very.
They aren't messing around.
Yeah.
They aren't messing around, and that's right. And I deliberately spoke to people, not just in the U.S. and not just in the military, the intelligence services, but folks on the Hill of both parties, people in Eastern and Western Europe that have different experiences of this. The Eastern Europeans certainly more aware and alarmed, but Western Europeans too. And then spending time in Asia. Across the board, there's genuine concern and a feeling that we have to acknowledge that and find ways forward to avoid the worst outcomes.
Okay, I'm getting my team ready to ask the first question, but executive director's prerogative. I'm going to do just one follow-up on that. Because all these individuals are public servants. You served in government as well. We've seen some deterioration, with confidence in public service. How important is that we have confidence in the people that are willing to do this work? And did you feel that sense of public service with them?
I did. I mean, I would say, from my time in government, one of the primary lessons from that, but just from the work that I do when I'm speaking to folks in the intel agencies of the State Department or the military, and including with our allies too. I went on a embark with a NATO task force in the Baltic Sea, where there were half a dozen different nations involved. Here is that there are a lot of good people doing their best and making sacrifices, and who are committed to a mission, not just to defend what they think is important, but to find ways forward so that we don't go to war. And I think we could take some comfort from that. On the downside, and Mark Milley talks about this, is that our domestic cohesion is suffering. And as there's a loss of confidence in institutions, from Congress to the government, to the intelligence agencies, to the military, to the media, then people choose their own facts, right, and their own realities, and that's a problem. And they treat their own as the enemy, as a target, and that's debilitating. And it's very real, and we haven't found our way out of that. I mean, again, this election will be a primary example of that. Yeah.
Okay. Is there a question from a student? I think we have plenty of time to get ready. We got one right over here. Okay. Go ahead. And if you can tell us what school you're in, that would be great.
I'm in the School of Public Affairs. Okay, so 1939 basically witnessed a failure of international cooperation, the League of Nations. I have not read the book yet, so have you basically written off the United Nations as helpless to constrain Chinese and Russian aggression?
Pretty much, right, because they got vetoes. They have veto power, and it's and they've been using their veto power to support each other, right? China often rejecting resolutions that condemn the invasion, for instance. I mean, the UN is, there are a lot of folks who are just done with the UN, right? You hear it here, you hear it elsewhere. There are others who aren't quite ready to give up on it yet, and I might be in that camp. I mean, there are even some of the most skeptical European leaders I met with said that it has the structure that we can use to do things. Whether we use that structure is another question, but it has the structure. If you have. And sometimes you see, listen, you saw a resolution passed the other day regarding Israel. which is trying to push for a ceasefire, right? I mean, you have, whether that, accomplishes anything, I don't know yet. We'll see. At times you see where there's surprising unity, you could at least apply pressure for better outcomes. But it's, I mean, the thing is, you could get rid of the UN, but you don't have anything better right now, sadly. That's the trouble. So arguably the better approach would be to try to fix it in some way, but that would require good leadership, and it would require cooperation, between these powers that we're not. In fact, we're seeing the opposite of that now. We're seeing more clashes. There are exceptions to that. The U.S. and China do speak substantively about climate change and so on. And both the US and China independently are making enormous steps in renewable energy and other things. So they're, not all hope is not lost. So I might be of the view better to fix it than to throw it out.
Oh, yes.
Hi, I'm Sydney Weinstein. I'm also SPA. And I had a question, a little cybersecurity focus. With China kind of sweeping through Africa and sweeping kind of into South America, and they're in the South Atlantic, a big concern for the US. I was wondering, with like cyber capabilities not being really a thing in the past, we can't draw on that past history for like moving forward lessons. What type of tactics should the US like take in order to feel like a power? Because I don't have clearance, I don't know, what we're actually doing. But it kind of feels like as a citizen, we're losing the fight against China spreading their red space.
So the global South is, and I always feel, reluctant to write off an entire section of the world with dozens of countries and, many billions of people. It just was the global South, because of course there are different pieces to that and different interests and so on. But it both Africa and Latin America, and certainly the Pacific, are fields of play and constant back and forth between the great powers. And to some degree, the U.S. is losing ground in those places. To other degrees, China and Russia aren't perfect by any means either. I think it's important in all of this not to imagine that they're 10 feet tall, because they make mistakes and miscalculations and have weaknesses too. Belt and Road, for all its success extending China's influence, has also ticked off a lot of people, a lot of these countries, because it is by its nature, it's extractive, right? And I mean, if you look at the experience of Sri Lanka, right, we'll help you build the port and we'll put you in debt, and by the way, give it to us for a 99-year lease, which I've always interesting to me, because the 99-year lease on Hong Kong is still a sour subject for Beijing. It's like, imposed on us by Western powers when we were weak, and this shall not stand. I was like, you just imposed one on Sri Lanka. Okay, so, don't come to me cry, unless you want to change. I mean, I'm just saying, like, and that kind of behavior turns off some of those partners too. Wagner Group is very active in Africa. They're good at pulling off some coups here and there, but they're not particularly popular, right? I mean, the U.S., Secretary Blinken makes the point in the book that the U.S. has a far greater humanitarian assistance support to African nations by dollar value. Whether that money is always smartly spent, I don't know. But also, PEPFAR, is one of the greatest foreign aid examples in the last 20 years, right? I mean, it literally saved tens of millions of lives in Africa for no cost. There was no like, oh, and by the way, give us your oil, or give us your rare earths in return. So the U.S. has some advantages in terms of the way it plays that game, but it's definitely being fought now, and it's not clear that we're winning.
Another question. We have one over here.
I mean, I'll say, like, when you look at the Pacific, so what does the country, just on that point, because it's smart, it's not Micronesia. There was Solomon Islands, China just basically brought them into their camp. But, China in the last few years lost Australia, right? And the reason Australia dove into the AUKUS treaty, which is this Australian, UK, US nuclear sub-agreement, is in large part because of that. They're like, we threw our lot in with China, and now China is trying to crush us. You know what? We need American protection. So yes, China gets the Solomons, but they lost Australia. So they're not undefeated, as it were, in this kind of field of play.
Hi, I'm a School of Public Affairs student, and I was wondering about if you could talk about Taiwan and the possibility of an invasion of Taiwan and how that would affect this foreign relation.
So that is, and a couple chapters in the book about it, because that is, there's an enormous amount of concern about China's intentions vis-a-vis Taiwan. There's not a single person I interviewed for this book, whether in Europe or Asia or here in the US, who did not make a direct connection between Ukraine and Taiwan, in that they believe that China is watching the world's response to Ukraine very closely to inform its own calculus about what would happen if it were to invade Taiwan. How stiff would the economic costs be? How lasting would they be? How long would the West stick together in opposition? But also how well Ukraine has been able to defend itself against a larger adversary, which would be a similar dynamic to Taiwan against China. There are a lot of differences, one being Taiwan as an island, so just fundamentally harder to invade, because typically going back to the Peloponnesian Wars, a amphibious invasion is really darn hard. You know, the D-Day was almost an exception as a successful one. So, and Taiwan's defenses are built to make it really hard to do that. So that makes it harder for China. What makes it harder for Taiwan is that there is no land bridge, right? So once the war starts, you can't keep resupplying them. And if you look at recent Chinese military exercises, what they've been practicing is encircling the island and cutting it off. And that's why there's a growing view that it may be that China's most likely move, if it were to make the move, would be the boa constrictor, as opposed to the straightforward invasion that they try to, blockade and through economic and political pressure, just get Taiwan to say uncle. And so it's a genuine concern. A notable change of this administration, by the way, this is another thing that would, that the election is going to decide, really. I mean, this is the other point, like, our election is going to decide major questions for people around the world, right? If you're Taiwanese, if you're Ukrainian, if you're Estonian.
Be a total different.
100%. But I tell a story in the book that John Bolton tells about Trump when he was president. Bolton was his national security advisor. That Trump would sit at the Resolute desk in the Oval Office and pick up a Sharpie. As you know, he likes Sharpies. And point to the tip of the Sharpie and say, see that's Taiwan. And see this desk, that's China. To make the point that Taiwan has no chance against China, and therefore we should not defend them. So Biden was the first president to commit the US to a military response in explicit terms to a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. Trump would go in the opposite direction. So again, it's another case where our votes in the fall are going to determine a security question for Taiwan.
How about one more? Do we have?
Hi, I'm a SIS student, and I was wondering, so I know there's a lot of pushback and a lot of outcry from the right, mostly the far right, against US aid to Ukraine. Yeah. And I know Speaker Johnson has indicated that he would be willing to work with Democrats to push funding through. But I was wondering, how likely is it that US aid to Ukraine could diminish or even disappear, even if the Dems are able to keep the White House and make victories in the upcoming elections?
Well, more immediately, I don't know if the aid's going to get passed, right? Johnson's been saying that for some time, but he hasn't moved. And there are a whole host of different ways they're considering, including a discharge position, which conceivably Democrats could go around his leadership. But my understanding of that now is that that's an outlier. So they're still negotiating. The other wild card in this is Trump, because Trump has made clear to his closest allies in Congress he doesn't want it, right? And he said, if I'm president, aid is done. And he's putting pressure on them now. So you would have to be a Republican and cast a vote for such aid, or to be a speaker and allow it to come to the floor, you'd have to be willing to get crushed by Trump, right? And courage is in short supply on Capitol Hill, you may have noticed. So I'm not convinced that's going to happen. I speak to lawmakers involved regularly. In fact, I'm going to interview a Republican tomorrow on this who say they're not going to let it go and that we're going to find a way. And I've spoken to Democrats who are working with Republicans and finding a way forward. But I've heard that same story for weeks now. So we'll see. I mean, let's say it gets passed. It's first of all, if Trump's elected, game over. If not, and it's Biden, it may be that it's tailing off right over time because it is becoming less popular over time. Americans, we have short attention spans. We tend to get bored with things that are, even our own wars, we get bored with after a couple of years. So it's probably peaked. But I think for the sake of the Ukrainians, and I think for our own security and the sake of NATO, I really hope they come to a deal because it's difficult to see how Ukraine survives without it.
So I'm going to wrap things up. It's hard to believe, Jim, we've already spent an hour and we haven't even scratched the surface, kind of what's in the book. But I would love some final thoughts. I think it's interesting when you read the book, you'll find out that you have traveled and reported from over 50 countries around the globe, which is unbelievable. It's afforded such an important global perspective for you. But this book is definitely a wake-up call to alert us about a serious situation. But I'd love some of your final thoughts and what concerns you, but what also are you optimistic, as we look forward?
So one thing I would say just to you as you're making your choices about what you're going to do next and what you study. When I was in your position, deciding my major 35 years ago, I had not spent a day out of the country. I'd been to like Mexico, right? I mean, that was the extent of my foreign travel. I knew I wanted to go overseas. I didn't really know where. It could have been anywhere. I would have gone to the Solomon Islands. I don't care. I just wanted to go overseas. As I began to study China, I ended up applying for a Fulbright to go to Hong Kong, which I did. And I'm forever grateful to the Fulbright program for giving me the chance to do that. And that then opened up, this kind of passion and this discovery that journalism is a nice way to do it because, as I like to say, it's a paid, free traveling education about the world, where you go. And I'm still passionate. I still love hopping on the plane to go to whatever that place is. And there's no substitute, whether you're a journalist or an academic, or a business person or a student of the world. There's no substitute for seeing it firsthand, going there and seeing it right before your eyes. So I would encourage you, if you're interested in it, to find a way to go. There's always a way to go, and there are more ways to go today, even when I was a kid. So what am I hopeful about? I'm hopeful that there are good people in all these places that I travel that are committed to a peaceful future and one where we can work together. And there's a lot of talent there. And just as technology can get us into trouble, technology can also help us, used in the right way. I mean, AI has a lot of bad applications, including as a force multiplier for many of these weapons that we talk about, but it also has some good applications. We, on the environmental front, we made enormous progress in a short period of time, in part due to technology and people caring, right, and making brave decisions. I will say that courage is the biggest factor, and that applies to our politics, applies to our own individual decisions, and it applies to this big question of rejecting 1939 rules. And a quote came to mind as well. And again, so many of these quotes were from another time, but they are relevant today. And it's Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who was, of course, a prominent Russian dissident. And I'm paraphrasing here, but his quote was about courage. And he said that, the decline of courage is a good sign that the end is coming. I'm talking about the end of days. I'm talking about the end of a nation, that when people stop having the courage to stand up for what they believe in or for positive change, that's a good sign that you're not long for this world. And so as Americans, we have to have courage to stand up for what we believe in and to do our best to make positive change possible.
I think that's an incredible way to end. Let's thank our speaker. Jim, as I said, we were absolutely honored to have you as a distinguished lecturer. I will say that at the Sine Institute, we always say it's even more important what you do when you leave the room during these gatherings than, when you're here. I think one of the big things is, certainly buy a copy book on the way out. They make lovely gifts. But it's not just that. Continue the conversation. Like, this is something that you can bring into other places, and ask the questions, have the conversation. If these are things that have interested you, certainly follow you on your social media. Be aware, get engaged in the issues of the day, not only the ones that seem to affect you every day, but have a global perspective, which is so important, and engage in these conversations. I always feel like the more that we define topics as, oh, we can't talk about that, the greater the problems come.
To that point, if I could just add, the baseball bat doesn't work, right? Just as it doesn't work with domestic political conversations. And I'm sure if your Thanksgiving table is anything like mine, those could be difficult conversations on some of these issues. But it's, we were talking, I was on the Daily Show earlier this week, and Jordan Klepper is the host. And if you've watched, Jordan Klepper is their field correspondent who goes and talks to Trump voters and tries to have this kind of conversation, because that's important to do, because you cannot convince people by talking down to them or shouting them. Of course, sometimes if conversation just ain't working, probably better to walk away. But that in any of these things, like for instance, when I'm talking about this phenomenon, I can't walk into the room and say, you're an idiot if you don't believe America has to stand up for these things. You have to say, here's the history, here's what's happening now, here's why it's important and it's in our interests. Dispense with the baseball bat and try to use knowledge and argument and passion. You tend to get a better outcome.
Boy, am I glad I was in that coffee shop that day, let me tell you. We have some refreshments for you outside. Please continue the conversation, meet some other people. And again, thank you, Jim. We'll be following you as you travel around the world.
Appreciate it.